night whispering in the trees. It's two cities and they're only.
But all the way back with a band called Johnny and the Moondogs, I believe the Quarrymen might have been the first band. Lennon meets McCartney somewhere when Lennon is the age of 16, McCartney a 15-year-old musician in Liverpool. Harrison comes along a little bit later. In the meantime, they had Pete Best on drums, and a cat named Stu Sutcliffe, who often is forgotten, was the bass player for the Quarrymen, Johnny and the Moondogs, and the Beatles. And they played in the Cavern, also in Hamburg. Stu Sutcliffe was their bass player, and he wasn't much of a musician. He was actually some type of artist or another. Not much of a musician, but he was a friend of Lennon's, and Lennon just wanted him around. He was kind of, you might call him atmosphere personnel. Well, Stu Sutcliffe died very young. Hope I got his name right. At a very young age, either of a brain tumor or cancer, something tragic happened. It was at that time, as I recall, that McCartney picked up the bass and said, I can do it. I'll play the left-handed bass. No problem. So they made a little transition there. Everybody's sick of Pete Best and his mother in the band. I don't think he wasn't a bad drummer. I think he was average, adequate, at least maybe to good, or even could have been great. And Ma Best did all the booking and kind of managed the band. I think Lennon just grew sick and tired of Ma. The general rumor or feeling was that the Beatles wanted Pete Best gone because he was the best looking of the group and was getting all the chicks. So he had to go. I'm not sure if that's true or not. Being in a band by yourself, I could see where that could be an issue. But I lean towards the chemistry factor more than anything else. I think Lennon, along in a conversation somewhere along the lines with McCartney, said, Pete's just not working out, man. He's dragging us down. He's a good enough drummer, but he's just not fitting in. We're not going anywhere with this guy because he aggravates me. I think may have been more, and the old lady really aggravates me. So he had to go. Along comes Ringo Starr, who happened to pick up the drums, and when they went to the studio to do Love Me Do, Ringo couldn't handle the tune. So they grabbed a studio drummer by the name of Randy White, I believe, and he is actually the drummer on the Love Me Do cut that the 45 that was released that we all know and love. It was not Ringo. There is a version of Ringo out there. I actually have it somewhere, but I'm not going to dig around for it. If it doesn't pop up in the next couple of minutes somewhere when I'm digging around, maybe during the news, I'm not going to go crazy looking for it. But I do have the original Ringo on drums, and you can see or hear that the Ringo wasn't ready for this tune, and the studio drummer Randy White obviously was. Ringo did play the tambourine. If you want to chomp into it, Ringo played the tambourine during Love Me Do. So he was in the studio, and he is in the song as a performer, but he's merely shaking his tambourine, man. But after Johnny and the Quarrymen and then Johnny and the Moondogs, or the Quarrymen, Johnny and the Moondogs, the Beatles start to hit their stride, and they do it kind of in a miracle way. And they did it like this. Must have been devised by John Lennon, who was the leader of the band. Okay, we're going to go to Hamburg and bill ourselves from Liverpool, right out of Liverpool, something along those lines, and pop in and get out of the country. I'm literally, instead of going to London or instead of going to some other clubs in smaller towns or middle English towns in Britain, Lennon says, we'll get out of the country, and he takes the Beatles to Germany. And then works it both ways to the middle, which was the genius of it all, was to come back to Liverpool and then bill themselves as back from Hamburg, the Beatles. And it attracted a lot of attention. Now that part of the story was more by design than by coincidence. But I believe it was more of a coincidence than by design that the Beatles hooked up with Brian Epstein. After several record companies had turned them down, they were giving them what they felt was their best stuff at the time, and being turned down 4 or 5 different times. And other bands were going strong in England at that time. I mean, the Beatles were not Jerry and the Pacemakers. It just wasn't their style. The Beatles were more of the leather jacket, brawling in the back alley kind of dudes. They didn't back down from fights. In fact, I'm sure Lennon was looking for fights at the time. It was part of the era in the 50s. Nobody shoved you around. You got a leather coat on, you're not going to get shoved around. The Beatles were taking a beating because they were coming in from Liverpool, the local German bands in Hamburg. They were PO'd. Don't think it doesn't happen. Bands sabotage each other all the time. They would send guys in to cause fights and just disrupt the gig just in order to keep the Beatles from getting a foothold on the crowd. But their popularity grew and grew, and then back to Liverpool. Again, I believe it's more of a coincidence that they hooked up with Epstein because anybody could have grabbed them along the way. Epstein completely changed their appearance, their persona. They went from the leather coats to the Beatles suits. You guys are nice boys because people need nice boys. People like nice boys. We don't want brawlers and fighters. More of a Dave Clark 5 or Animals, Eric Burton look. People like nice boys. So he turned their persona from the leather jacket, brawler, scrappers, knuckle in the mouth kind of guys into more of the nice kind of guy. The biggest coincidence, I think, that occurred early in their career, which really made their career, it was the beginning of Beatlemania. When the Beatles returned from Hamburg, or were returning from Hamburg at Heathrow Airport, just by accident, there happened to be a television show host by the name of Ed Sullivan, Ed Sullivan, a really, really big shoe, just happened to be passing, catching a plane, transferring, or what have you, in Heathrow Airport when the Beatles were returning from Hamburg, and he catches some of the excitement. And he says, "What's all this about?" And follows up on it, and then offers the Beatles a chance to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. He was intrigued, and he was actually impressed by the mayhem that was going on at Heathrow. Now, Epstein does a very, very smart thing at that time. Rather than take the big money for one appearance that Sullivan was offering the boys, Epstein redid the contract, renegotiated the contract. They may have did it on the spot. Into, we'll take very little money. We're not concerned about the money. You can pay us peanuts. Just give us lodging, but give us more appearances, and we'll take less money.